Welcome back to Paris Lesbos. One of us is a pixie, the other gets called Rena, and this is a truly passionate Italianate nature episode. Forget Olga de Meyer. Luisa Casati claims this title with introvert scandal, exotic menageries as jewelry, costumes that put Lady Gaga to shame, and a resemblance to Elsa von Freytag-Lorenhoven's antics.
Introvert scandal? I think that sounds by far the most different from anything else we've heard before. But I guess we'll see what happens there.
To give you a taste of this episode's filling, we have an excerpt of a foreword by Quentin Crisp. Without question, the Marchesa Casati was an exhibitionist. But exhibitionism is a potent drug. After a short time, a dose strong enough to kill a novice no longer works. In her own words, I want to be a living work of art. Before we get to the baby ball, we have to start at the beginning on January 23rd, 1881 in Milan. The daughter of the Count and Countess Milan had a typical upper-class upbringing for the time. There were governesses and visits to art galleries and her own decision to practice drawing daily, which led to praise from relatives. Yet, Luisa was an introvert, and her shyness was not helped by the lack of regular contact with other girls her own age, which was typical for an education provided by tutors rather than a school system at this time. There was also the fact that by 13, she was aware that her older sister was the more conventional beauty. She herself was boyish, but had very intense, vivid green eyes.
Was there a rivalry there?
There is a bit of a rivalry between the two, but there's also mixed feelings. For instance, decades later, with the death of her sister, there's more than just sadness, we'll say. Unfortunately, her parents died young. Her mother died of an unknown illness in April 1890, and her father followed from what was probably an accident in July 1896 when she was 15. And by unknown illness, I mean that is how her biographers wrote it. So I assume everyone else at the time knew what it was, but it just didn't get recorded. An aunt and uncle took Luisa and her sister in after this. The fact that they had become the wealthiest heiresses in Italy was not a consolation. At the age of 17 in 1898, Luisa attended the unavoidable debutante ball, an introvert's nightmare. Possibly as a rebellion, she cut off her hair into a fringe style that unintentionally drew one's gaze to her eyes. She would retain a variation of this hairstyle for the rest of her life. Now a debutante, Luisa reluctantly attended the circuit of parties and theatrical productions expected of members of her social class. At 18, she caught the attention of Camillo Casati Stampa di Sonsino at one such party. He was the 21-year-old son of a knight of the Order of Malta, and himself a cavalry lieutenant. The marriage followed a trend. Luisa lacked lineage, but had money from grandparents in industry. Camillo's family, on the other hand, was on the roll call of Italian nobility for generations, but might as well have been broke. And so she became Marchesa Luisa Casati in June 1900, with a honeymoon to the 1900 Exposition in Paris. Within 2 years, they had a daughter, Christina. So far, so normal. But by 1903, Luisa was starting to chafe at the restrictions of her life as a demure Catholic wife. Her husband would be off hunting, leaving her to decorate the house. Instead, she took up pursuits that let her experience the world beyond her home, namely fashion and the occult. This could initially be dismissed as tolerable feminine pastimes. When he was home, Camillo supported her interests, but he wasn't home often. During the course of this, Luisa's shyness fell away as her boredom and irritation at the lack of attention from her husband increased. By now, Luisa started making comments disdaining conventional married life like, I hate the family story. The man and woman on each side of the table with a little piece of meat in the middle. Quel horreur.
So wait, did she miss him or did she was she just lonely cuz she didn't have anyone to interact with as a housewife?
I would imagine if you were married to someone that you didn't hate, but also it wasn't a love match, and you were lonely, you would eventually miss them, in at least in part because you're lonely and you know the person and they're supposed to be there.
Yeah, fair enough. No, and she just didn't have a lot of interaction. So, boy, that sounds rough. It sounds, I mean, it sounded like she'd found some good things to do with her time, but if there's really no one to share it with, then what's the point?
This is also the point where her interest in fast racehorses began to transition to fast cars and emerging technology.
Yeah, it does say like she is developing a lot of eclectic hobbies, but is she actually like meeting other people through them? Like when she's interested in the racehorses, is she going to races? Is she hanging out with other people?
So you see, she did attend these horse races and hunting expeditions, and it's at one of these, actually, that Luisa encountered the Italian poet Gabriel D'Annunzio. He has cropped up before on this podcast in the painter Romaine Brooks and the actress Eleanor Deuce's episodes. You may even remember me describing him as a gnome because he looked like one. Now, unfortunately, from where I'm standing, at 22, Louisa began an affair with this 40-year-old gnome looking man. Her reasoning started with how refreshing it was to meet a man who simply admired her and didn't bother with concerns over highborn etiquette and how a woman should behave.
I mean, it sounds legit. Sounds like what she's looking for.
D'Annunzio, for his part, saw her as being close to what he believed was the best type of woman, or at least the type of woman that he had been searching for. And she was also a way to make money. The biographers Ryerson and Yacarino say he discovered a way to financial solvency through the boudoir. This makes it sound very much like this man was a sugar baby before his time.
The best type of woman, the woman who will give me money.
What I find most interesting about this description, by the way, is the fact it turns the whole image of D'Annunzio on its head. Like, this is a man who everyone plays up the whole militaristic poet, adventurer, or want to be adventurer, a man's man sort of image in a lot of the descriptions of him. This is very much not that sort of image.
Yeah, which is interesting because usually you don't encounter a relationship in which there's like an older man and a younger woman and he's the sugar baby. So feminism wins this time, I guess. I don't know.
And now this starts our transformation into the outrageous and bizarre. For instance, Luisa attended a series of balls in Rome in March 1905. At one, she dressed in a reproduction of Sarah Bernhardt's costume of the Byzantine Empress Theodora. At the baby ball, her costume was inspired by a children's book. And yes, the title of the ball was the theme. Grown adults in baby bonnets sipping champagne out of baby bottles while wielding small rattles.
That sounds like a fetish thing, but okay.
When one is wealthy, is it a fetish or is it eccentric?
Now there's questions.
Now, it doesn't sound too odd aside from the baby ball, but for an introvert, it's the start of a change. Louisa slowly began to dye her brown hair with a tawny tint, and her clothes became more adventurous outside of parties. Namely, they played up her unusual height and androgynous thinness. No, I don't know how tall she was, but I'd say this implies taller than usual. There was also an addition of going from pale to pale enough that she could have maybe passed for a corpse.
Was it sunscreen and parasols? Was she bleaching her skin? I mean, that doesn't sound like something that happens easily.
I think it would have been a combo of staying out of the sun and makeup that would have resulted in this. Rumors also began that she was a sorceress.
I mean, it sounds like she's starting to look a bit different. Is she doing anything to seem like a sorceress?
Probably due to the occult. Meanwhile, friends sympathized for her husband and child as gossip appeared in the papers. Said husband turned a blind eye in order to keep going hunting, especially in England, while D'Annunzio tried to forget Luisa's husband even existed. Also, unfortunately for the poet, Luisa developed a narcissism which prevented him from getting her focused solely on him. Within a few years, she had abandoned her shyness, though to many it seemed like they still did not know what her true personality was like. Likewise, D'Annunzio loved this transformation and continued to be bemused by it. By this point, Luisa had also moved to Venice, as she'd grown dissatisfied with the homes she'd decorated for Camillo, her husband.
Wait, homes plural?
For Italian nobility, they have multiple houses. Naturally, it was not a typical mansion she settled in. It said the lighting was designed in such a way as to give the sense of a sacred space, and could make you feel like you had to worship as if you were in a cathedral. The interior was white everywhere, white walls, ceilings, and drapes. Common for today, but not for back then during a more colorful era. There was also a horde of cats, and some greyhounds, and a mastiff guarding the gates, which to me feels like a nod to Cerberus guarding the gates to the underworld, which may tie into the fact D'Annunzio nicknamed her Kore, the other name for the goddess Persephone. To the rest of the area's wealthy, Luisa was just as unsettling as her house. Her clothes now came only in black and white to go with her cadaver pallor, and slightly fiery dyed hair. Apparently, unlike Romaine Brooks, she could not pull this color scheme of her wardrobe off. This attire was in addition to being a known adulteress who was now associating with artists. As artist, mangy poor lot. Woe is the reputation of any who dare talk to us. As an heiress with a fondness for visual arts, they naturally started orbiting her as a patroness. This is also the start of her becoming the subject of various paintings that you can still see today. If you want, you can find photos of them on Google. I will say that out of all of these, I personally prefer the portrait that Baldini did of her, and I'm not sure if it's due to his style or because Luisa became more bizarre later on. Reason being that a lot of her portraits make her feel like an alien creature staring at you, or at least that's how they make me feel. This is also where we see Luisa's growing exhibitionist mania, as Ryerson and Iaccarino say in their biography of her.
Now you've mentioned exhibitionism before. Is this the like streaking in a public event sort of exhibitionism, or is this a more metaphorical thing?
It's not usually the sexual variety of exhibitionism. So just put that out of your head, because it sounds like the few times it veers into that territory, it's people talking about bruises or bite marks from D'Annunzio, and oddly not any of her other lovers. And yes, that relationship continued for many years. So Luisa's exhibitionism was more about creating a spectacle. For instance, it led to throwing a masquerade at a Venetian palace. If I had to sum up the period we're about to dive into, it'd be with what Baron Adolf de Meyer, Olga's husband, said. The Marchesa Casati, at sunset, reclining in her gondola, wrapped in tiger skins, and fondling her favorite leopard, is a sight to be seen only in Venice. She did decorate her new gondola in damask, along with tiger and leopard skins. She also acquired a pair of cheetahs. So by this time in 1910, Luisa had an almost mythical level persona that people in several countries were aware of.
Yeah, wow. Eat your heart out, Lady Gaga.
To add to this mythos, she started outlining her eyes with black coal and staining her eyelids with India ink. She also wore false eyelashes to increase their length. Meanwhile, her husband in Milan doesn't appear distressed by any of this. He continued about his life, and they would officially separate 4 years later. Their 9-year-old daughter, meanwhile, was educated in a Catholic convent. Rather odd choice for an artsy individual. Luisa's palazzo soon became like an amusement park, meanwhile. There were mechanical birds trilling in gilded cages, gardens surrounded lagoons. The place was awash in torchlight during parties, and of course, there were white peacocks on the grounds. She also added monkeys and snakes to this menagerie. Luisa was reported to sometimes wear the snakes as jewelry. To give you a further taste, there was a party where Luisa entered via gondola, with a symphony playing in other gondolas, lit by Chinese lanterns with flag bearers present. Her patronage of artists also continued. This is how she met Baron and Baroness Adolf and Olga de Meyer. By 1912, he had created several photographs of her, which I also personally prefer to most of the paintings done of her. By this point, Luisa is also using belladonna eye drops, which is made from the roots and leaves of deadly nightshade, and was the cause of her unnaturally large pupils. This cosmetic was actually common at the time, despite the known negative side effects. For Luisa, she would use it for the rest of her life to enhance the part of her face that already drew the most attention.
Oh, deadly nightshade. That sounds like a great thing to put in your eyes.
In 1914, Luisa and her husband were legally separated, but they then forced their 13-year-old daughter to choose which parent she'd live with. She chose Luisa, who kept her in a convent school. The divorce would only occur in 1924. During World War I, Luisa doesn't really change. She doesn't become a nurse or an ambulance driver like some of the other women on this podcast, and personally I'm not surprised considering her personality. Instead, she tried to rouse the spirits of ancient dead warriors at Appia Antica with D'Annunzio in June 1915 at midnight.
Grounded, practical work to help with the war effort. Now, isn't he a soldier in the war?
D'Annunzio doesn't really get involved until later and sort of the end of the war and flying, and there's a part of Italy that is no longer part of Italy after the war, and it's a whole lot focused on him.
Got it. Yeah, and Italy was only pretty recently unified, right? I mean, like within her lifetime, or maybe that's before.
If you're looking for a date for when Italy became a country, you would be looking for 1861.
Okay, okay. So, within, I guess, her parents' lifetimes, probably? Grandparents? I don't know. But yeah.
In the years following World War I, Luisa spent a large chunk of time on the island of Capri via a legal loophole. The doctor Axel Munthe was begged by employees at a nearby hotel to let Luisa stay the night because there was a problem at the hotel and she was being difficult. Finally, after hours of back and forth, all the while there's a downpour on her luggage in the street, he relented on the condition that her luggage would remain outside of the gates of his villa. The next day, Axel went to his villa and found all of Luisa's luggage inside the villa. He demanded she leave the house. She just smiled and said, "But weren't you the one to consent to my entry into the villa? Do you ignore the law? Didn't you know that when you let me into the villa, you also gave me the right to stay here for as long as I please? My lawyers have been contacted and they are all ready to prepare papers." So it turns out that Italian law backed her staying and leasing the villa despite any change of his mind because she had his written permission.
What?
In fact, the law would back her on staying for several years, so he was stuck on copium and hopium. Talk about convoluted squatters' rights. It reminds me of that case in North Carolina recently about a man who found out the local government transferred his property deed to a random woman without ever contacting him about it, just because she turned up at a clerk's office and said she bought the property.
What is the deal with this? Isn't Louisa's whole thing that she's insanely wealthy? Like, why does she need to steal this guy's house?
So the thing is, they had been telegramming back and forth about Luisa potentially renting his villa because she'd been looking for a place to rent on Capri. And he had initially said yes, but then he sent another telegram saying no because he'd heard about her habits and behaviors. But because of the initial telegram, basically, and the fact that she knew Italian law, she put him in a bind, and so she stayed. And that is how we now have Luisa settled on Capri in the 1920s. Naturally, she now meets other women of our podcast. Luisa invited Romaine Brooks to dinner as soon as she knew that Romaine was on the island. Soon after, Romaine was bombarded with visit requests from Luisa, which flattered the painter, but it also made Romaine wary. Luisa wanted Romaine to paint her portrait, and Romaine kept coming up with feeble excuses. She had no canvas. No problem, Luisa would get one, or Romaine could paint on cloth or board. Romaine did not want to travel to the Marchesa's villa. Then Luisa would travel to Romaine's villa several times a week for sittings. Backed into a corner, Romaine lied and said she only painted nudes, which she thought would instantly kill the project. Luisa happily agreed to pose naked without a single hesitation. After all, she had been painted nude before, not that Romaine knew that. And so, canvas, schedule, and lack of clothes decided, Romaine began the portrait in August 1920, and I can just hear the sigh over letter to Natalie in Paris.
This is crazy, but also I get it from Casati's perspective. Because if you look up any picture or painting of Casati and any painting by Romaine Brooks, you can see there is so much overlap in their aesthetics. Like, truly, Luisa Casati was meant to be painted by Romaine Brooks. But also, this is such a wild interaction. Do we know why Romaine was so adamantly refusing to paint her?
So we have some of Romaine's letters to Natalie back in Paris about this. For instance, there's, "I've begun the portrait of Casati, an immense life-size nude. I foresee with fear the amount of work this will demand of me. She has been most enthusiastic. Adieu to the moments of idleness and the joys of summer." So it's like she's on summer vacation, and there's this woman badgering her to paint her. And then on top of that, it turns out Luisa does not even completely adhere to the schedule that she herself set for the posing sessions. She'd leave for a trip to Rome on a whim, and Romaine wouldn't know if or when she'd be back. Add to the fact that Romaine, as a painter at this point, like, she is an heiress in her own right. She doesn't paint commissions, really. She doesn't really do it for money. She paints the people she wants to paint.
Yeah, okay, so I see. She was not in the headspace to be completing a big work of art here.
Yeah, it kind of is an intrusion, and yet it seems the two started flirting with each other at some point during this prolonged project. Like, it seems like it's 50-50 for if they have a fling here. As Romaine wrote, "She's really a remarkable woman. All the same, she is very much a spoiled child."
So wait, were they a thing? Because, like, this is not the best start to a relationship, but, like, yeah, what happened?
So, like, I think of it as like you're on vacation and you have a fling, but then because you're still in the same place a month later, the fling just wears itself out. Coupled with the erratic painting schedule that Romaine seems to have hated, I'm not really surprised that in September Romaine is writing to Natalie, "I am exhausted, I am losing weight, I am losing my hair, I am afraid, I need my rest." because it really sounds like Luisa was monopolizing Romaine's time. Now, despite what Ryerson and Yacarino say in their biography of Luisa, I do not believe the feelings come from just worry over Natalie's past or current polyamory or from any guilt over having her own affair. From our episodes on the two and on Lily de Gramont, that theory just doesn't track for me, considering how they had established being poly by this point. I think it more likely that Romaine was just growing tired of Luisa and couldn't get away fast enough. Like, her letters to Natalie asking her to come to Capri were not so much a guilt feeling sort of thing or in any way, shape, or form related to Natalie's past with the poet Renee Vivian or anything like that. It's more of a come save me from this exhausting, demanding woman, so that Romaine could essentially then do a deflection of, I can't meet you today, Luisa. I'm having lunch with Natalie.
Oh, too bad. My girlfriend showed up accidentally. Well, I guess I can't do it then. Oops.
Unfortunately for Romaine, Natalie did not arrive before the painting was completed. And when the painting was completed, Luisa complained that Romaine did not make her beautiful, but Romaine replied that she made her noble. The portrait itself would remain rolled up under Romaine's bed until her death, aside from a brief point of time where it was on the wall at Natalie's house. Luisa's biographers speculate that this is because of either dislike of the portrait or a fascination with the subject. I personally think she just didn't want to look at it and wanted to forget it, which you can't do if it's hanging up in a gallery or you sold it. Also, Romaine's biographer Langer leans towards dislike of the portrait and Casati. So that ends that chapter. A probable fling, an irritated artist, and a discarded painting.
So, did Casati learn anything from this experience?
Oh, hell no. Casati, for her part, continued to live her life as she had for decades. She lived lavishly and spent fortunes to renovate whatever residences she took across Europe. There were also incidents of more typical exhibitionism, like the time she greeted an Italian diplomat while entirely nude, except for an expertly placed large feathered fan. Luisa pulled much the same stunt at another gathering, according to the silent film actress Mae Murray.
Okay, so now we're talking like exhibitionism.
So it does lean more towards like shocking people, I guess like the typical exhibitionism then. However, by the end of the 1920s, her fortune was drying up. Like some of our other heiresses of the podcast, Luisa basically spent her fortune. She handled this reality with flippancy. She began with selling several possessions, including a statue once owned by Pope Alexander II. Soon, rather than money, she handed out diamond bracelets to taxi drivers, grocery store clerks, and others. Tax collectors came knocking soon after. By her 50th birthday in 1931, she owed 300,000 francs in France and about 20 billion lira in Italy. Her biographers Ryerson and Yacarino have estimated this debt as about that of $25 million today, and this wasn't the end. A check to a merchant effectively bounced, and Luisa was arrested. Her initial sentence of 2 years in prison was reduced to a suspended 2 months. The court then mandated a sale of her remaining property. D'Annunzio does not appear to have answered her plea for money, which included neither the nickname he gave her nor any sort of affection in her letter to him. So that relationship also ended, and Luisa was now broke. So she now lived in a series of apartments and hotel rooms in France, though somehow she had the funds to spend part of the 1930s in England. Luisa definitely settles in England by the start of World War II, though the exact date of the permanent move is debated. We do know that by 1942, the last of her funds had dried up. Family and associates would now give her £1 to £5 in an account for her each month, as Luisa insisted on trying to live as she once did, which included throwing parties if she had the funds. so everyone limited it to what would just keep her from begging for money. Despite these problems, Luisa continued to try and be fashionable, much like people chasing a high on Instagram. There are reports of her wearing skirts made out of brown parcel paper and dotted with leopard spots that I suppose she made with a pen. There was also a rumor that she was using discarded monkey fur from a music hall dresser for some of these outfits. That said, she could apparently still mimic people around her at restaurants and cause fits of laughter in her companions with her speculations about those people's lives. Naturally, as she sunk into obscurity, we have less information on her. It does appear that she cut ties with her daughter for the last decade of her life over her daughter embracing communism and her daughter's second husband banning her from their country estate in the 1950s.
Their communist country estate?
Yes. Then, at the age of 76, Luisa died of a cerebral hemorrhage on June 1st, 1957, after a spiritualist session. She was buried in a London cemetery with an epitaph taken from Shakespeare's description of Cleopatra in the play Antony and Cleopatra. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. That isn't the end, though. In 1998, Christian Dior had a fashion collection by John Galliano, inspired by Luisa. Flame hair, kohl-lined eyes, plumed tricorn hats, taffeta ball gowns that looked closer to a century before. There was also a fashion label named for her in the mid-2000s. This is in addition to films and books inspired by her, both while she was alive and after her death. There either is or was in production a few years ago a documentary about her as well, but I'm uncertain if the videos I found on YouTube were that. Despite her glorious peak being followed by a fade into obscurity, Luisa Casati lives on in the popular imagination when we think of bold fashion, outrageous interior design, and just a hint of the occult. Thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, don't forget to rate it and leave a review on your podcast app of choice or YouTube. Subscribe to learn more about the artists and patrons of the arts that made up Paris Lesbos and all the interconnecting tunnels that spread out from the left bank. And remember, you can divorce your husband, steal a villa on Capri, and get yourself painted by Rena's favorite artist. Or at the least you can try.